Courtney bit her lip as she watched her fellow mages spar with each other. Thanks to her matches with Margot, she'd improved a lot, but knew her skills were still lacking. At least she could help those less skilled in improving their craft. It was a small victory, though she'd hoped for a much larger one. An idea had been brewing in her mind all morning. It was fine and dandy for the mages to be at peak fighting form with their own skills. It was an entirely different one to be able to actually fight with their dragon counterparts. The two were so different and removed from each other. Regardless of what happened with Anwen, she knew something needed to change. They needed to learn how to fight together, or it would all be for nothing. She knew that before long, Callum would call for her to perform her duty as substitute Kaida. But, for the moment, he was up in some meeting with the other dragons. It actually gave her the perfect opportunity to press for what she wanted. Signaling one of the older mages over, she asked her to keep the matches going while she was gone. This might take a while, and Courtney could only hope it would go the way she wanted it to. With a look of determination on her face, Courtney moved away from the training group. Instead, she headed up the path towards the mountain gates. They'd taken up residence in the main courtyard for practice, which meant she had quite the trek ahead of her. But if she was lucky, she could make it before the meeting in the council chambers was over. If nothing else, they had to know how much this meant to her. And since it involved all of the dragons, it made sense. Not to mention that, as the temporary Kaida, she had a right to be there. It took her a little longer to get to the council chambers than she'd anticipated. Having participated in some of the sparring matches, she was a little worn out, but she still made it while the council was still in session. She took a moment to compose herself before entering the chamber, hoping none of them would blast her for insolence. She didn't know many of them all that well yet, and wasn't sure of their tempers. A rumble of voices greeted her the moment she stepped through the chamber doors, which fell off into silence. All eyes seemed to turn her way, and she couldn't help but feel small and insignificant. She wondered if this was how an ant felt before the shoe came down and smashed it.
"Greetings, friend of the Kaida,"
Kern spoke up. He arched his sinuous neck towards her.
"What brings you to the council this day?"
Courtney resisted the urge to shuffle her feet. Kern's tone was mentoring, not angry. Perhaps her errand wasn't a fool's one after all.
Sorry to interrupt you guys, but I wanted to make a request.
Callum frowned from his position next to the Nurrim.
You should bring all such inquiries to me first,
He stated.
That is why I was assigned as your liaison to the council.
Kern raised a clawed hand as if to hold his fellow dragon back.
"Peace.
He soothed.
As a stand-in Kaida, she has every right to be here. What do you wish to request?"
Feeling more than a little anxious with all eyes on her, Courtney cleared her throat.
It seems like we're missing out on a good opportunity.
She stated, wishing she had a drink of water. How on earth did Anwen manage not to lose her cool while talking to all these dragons?
What I mean is, if we're going to work together to defeat the Revenants, we need to work together.
She clarified.
Neither of us can defeat a Revenant alone. I was there when you guys took one down. You can't deny you didn't do it alone. If Anwen hadn't helped out, you'd be dragon kibble.
Several dragons further down the chamber murmured at her words. Their voices rumbled low in anger, but that didn't stop Courtney from pressing on.
Look, it's fine and dandy that you're okay with us mages practicing on our own, but if we want to have even a chance of winning this battle, we have to find a way to fight together. And that's not going to happen if we don't train together. We mages haven't ever fought alongside a dragon, unless you count recent events. And I know you guys haven't fought with a mage by your side for much longer. Why don't we help each other out and, I don't know, train with each other?
You are out of line!
Callum growled, others adding their agreement.
I have no qualms with your silly little game of war. But if you think we will train with you, teach you how we fight, you are sadly mistaken.
This is an outrage!
Preposterous!
It must not even be considered.
Kern sighed, his head shaking at the uproar. This woman seemed more than capable of inciting a riot if she so chose, and the fact that the dragons in the council were arguing over the matter was further proof to that point.
"Enough!
He belled out. Hints of fire leaped from his tongue with the blasted word.
We will have order."
Courtney couldn't help but flinch at the Nurrim's stern tone. She knew her interruption would cause some discord, though she hadn't realized it would be this much. Just how many of these dragons hated their mage counterparts.
I know you don't like us.
She spoke up in the resulting silence.
I know not all of you trust us. I don't blame you, but we come from the same origins. And like it or not, we need to help each other if we're going to win this battle.
Shamed by their leader, the other dragons remained silent. This mage was much more brash than the real Kaida. Perhaps it had been a fool's gamble to send her instead of this woman who stood before them, but they could not deny the power of her words.
What you request must be considered with all sincerity and attention.
Kern spoke up.
It is not a light thing you ask of us, but it is the right thing.
He held up a clawed hand to stay further comments.
Allow us to discuss the matter further. Return to the others, and we will decide what to do with the challenge you have issued.
The mage blinked a few times.
Challenge? It was never my intention to challenge the council.
But Kern gave her a look.
Go. We will summon you when we have come to some agreement.
The dismissal was final, and she knew it. With shaky legs, Courtney turned and left the chamber. It was out of her hands now, but at least she could still work and train with the other mages. The elephant was out in the open, as the saying went. It was now up to them to decide whether to ignore it or acknowledge it was there. Another branch almost slapped Walter in the face as they continued on their pathless quest. The trees surrounding the ruined city of Sorwell were dense. Even so, he couldn't help but give Tyler a bit of a look, even though he knew the dragon couldn't see him. And, strictly speaking, it wasn't entirely his fault. Tyler wasn't quite as tall as he was, though he could be a lot more careful about how he let those branches fly. At least he had the professional courtesy to hold the branches out of the way for Anwen. Knowing that, Walter decided to not be quite so upset over the repeated incident.
Come on,
Tyler urged.
we're close.
He moved ahead, anticipation tingling through him as he felt stones underfoot. They weren't irregular stones either. These stones were hewn by hand. You could tell by the feel of them under the earthy layer. Anwen moved forward with caution, not entirely sure on her feet. She still had a lot to learn about roughing it in the great outdoors, but she was learning. Hadn't she started the fire only that morning? It had taken more than she'd cared to admit, but she'd done it. And if she could do that, she could at least pretend to be a mountain goat. The ground wasn't quite as smooth as all the previous terrain they'd encountered so far. This made it more difficult, at least for her, but she wasn't about to complain. If the others could do it, she could too. Walter sped up in time to keep Anwen from tottering backwards after stepping on a loose stone.
Whoa, easy now.
He said gently.
Gotta keep an eye out for those.
He gave Tyler an admonishing glance before moving on. Apparently the dragon had gotten a little too caught up in the moment to notice the hazard. The Kaida nodded her thanks before continuing on. Tyler made this look way too easy. Perhaps there was some kind of secret to it, outside of his super long life and practical experience. She paused to glance up ahead, realizing the stones were getting larger and less tumbled. They started to actually resemble something that might have once been buildings. Most were in worse shape than what the mage circle had left in the ruined city, though. A sense of age vibrated up through her feet. It was almost as if the stones breathed, grinding out words to each other that she couldn't quite hear. She blinked a few times, reminding herself she still had to listen to hear them. It wasn't something she had grown accustomed to yet, though it probably wouldn't be a bad idea to try.
We're here,
Tyler said, breaking into her thoughts. He stood to one side of the tree break on a large flat stone. It tilted slightly to one side, a giant root protruding into the forest underneath it. He closed his eyes, hands raised a little from his sides. His posture suggested he was either listening or drinking in energy around him. Walter moved onto the tilted courtyard. Vines ran up the sides of the collapsed buildings of stone. Most were unrecognizable as anything more than a jumble of rock. A few still retained their more upright positions, showing lintels and doorways. Somewhere a trickle of water announced the presence of a stream or other small body of water. Anwen moved to join her companions. She stepped over what might have once been a bounding circle around the destroyed city. She felt as though her hair stood on end the moment she crossed over. The sensation wasn't quite like she'd crossed the boundary circle of the sacred grove, but it felt similar. There were no astral projections of her soul energy, but her entire body vibrated with something she couldn't quite identify. When all were within the courtyard, Tyler opened his eyes, dropping his hands back to his sides.
This used to be a place of great power,
He said, more than aware of the effect it had on Anwen. He could feel it like a low buzzing at the back of his skull. The Kaida blinked. For the briefest of moments, it seemed as though her vision blurred. An image of thriving city overlaid the one of ruins. Children laughed as they ran through the streets and around buildings. Wives waved to husbands as they walked past. Carts rolled across the stones lining the roadways. When her eyes readjusted to the present, she had to shake her head, a dull headache forming behind her eyes. Tyler moved to her side, placing an arm around her shoulders. in case she needed the support.
What did you see?
He asked, looking at her face. While he could feel what she felt, he still could not, nor was he sure he would ever be able to see what she saw. It was her gift, not his. Anwen pressed one hand to her temple, more than willing to let Tyler's arm drape across her shoulders.
I saw this place as it was before it fell.
She answered. In the back of her mind, she heard a child's laughter bubbling up as if from the stones.
It was a little disorienting.
Walter glanced over at Tyler's face, trying to read his expression. He was no more familiar with how Anwen's gifts worked than the dragon seemed to be. He knew about the dragon's sight and soul sight, but it didn't seem to work the same way for her as it did for the dragons. He turned to look around the area, pausing at a flash of red that quickly disappeared.
You know,
He said as he reached for a knife he kept on his belt.
I think we're not exactly alone here.
Tyler found he had to agree.
I feel a presence,
He confirmed.
but I can't identify it or where it's coming from.
He turned to look in the direction Walter was staring, squinting as if he could see through the buildings. Maybe he could,
Where are you?
he uttered to himself as he let his gaze travel over the panorama around them. The giggling came again and Anwen turned towards it. The sound came from the complete opposite direction her two companions were facing. Couldn't they hear it? Or was she meant to go alone? The sound did seem familiar, like she'd heard it before. And then, almost as if from the barest breath of wind, she heard that cherubic voice from the sacred island.
This way.
Not pausing to think about what she was doing, Anwen followed the instructions given her. The thrumming vibration increased in her feet. It moved up along her spine until it almost made her teeth rattle. But it wasn't unpleasant, so she kept going.
Which way?
She asked in soul speech, not sure who she was talking to. Another giggle escaped like bubbles from a fish's mouth, and she turned towards the new direction. An overgrown path led into shadow. Either she would have to conjure a light orb or trust there would be no obstacles in her path. She chose to go by blind faith, and the stones seemed to approve as they hummed with greater intensity. Underneath a low archway, Anwen ducked to avoid running into any plants she didn't know. Any could contain irritants, like poison ivy, and since she had no idea what poison ivy or any of the others looked like, she decided some caution wise. She blinked a few times as she stepped into the shadow. Despite the low light, her eyesight seemed more than up for the challenge. She hardly noticed the difference. The light just looked darker, though she could see just as clearly as if nothing blocked out the sun. The path turned a bit, though the stones underfoot remained true. And despite the lack of general traffic for who knew how long, the walkway remained clear. Either that or any plants, webs, or other obstacles melted away before she reached them. She didn't know which it might be and chose not to question it. After several more turns, Anwen came to a stop. The paving stones there weren't tilted from roots growing up underneath them. They lay flat as if freshly placed, and across that open space stood what could only be described as a holy place. Quartz glinted from non-existent sunlight as trees overshadowed the buildings from above, but the columns stood holding up the heavy ceiling blocks with a sense of majesty. Ornate carvings depicted dragons in all their forms. There were even hints of gold overlay hiding inside the carvings. Anwen couldn't help but stare. If any building in this city could be described as a temple, this place had to be it. She inhaled. The fragrant scent of mint and eucalyptus filled her senses, though she couldn't see what might give off that smell. It took her a moment to realize the vibrating sensation had left her. Heavy silence filled the void. It seemed as though the world waited for her to do something, though she wasn't entirely sure what.
In here.
The childlike voice whispered in her mind. The slight vibrations didn't disturb anything around it, but part of her felt it should. Without thinking, Anwen followed the call, her feet moving slowly across the flagstones. Her feet didn't make any noise as she moved. No dust kicked up at her passage. In fact, nothing marked it but for her own progress across the open courtyard, leaving nothing in her wake. Anwen climbed up 5 carved steps and across 15 paces of flat, marbled stone. She counted them in her mind as she walked them, coming to stop once more at the open archway leading inside. She bowed her head in reverence. This place was ancient in a way she might never understand. With a life of its own, it demanded respect. Having paid her respects, Anwen stepped across the threshold and into the inner sanctuary. Her shoes again didn't make a sound as she moved across the smooth floor. She moved towards a familiar-looking altar within. It reminded her of the one in the sacred grove, down to the strange symbols carved into the surface. A small part of her hesitated to touch it. Part of her feared inciting another vision, sure to render her unconscious. Another part whispered that this time would not be the same as before. Almost cautiously, she knelt a few feet away from the obsidian stone. She slid closer until she could look upon the surface without discomfort. Not pausing to think, she moved her hands to rest on either side of the stone. Her fingers touched the flat surface with feather lightness. Brilliant green light flared up from her ring, with blue resonating from the key around her neck. Without so much as a by your leave, the crystal key came free from her shirt. It flew to rest inches above the center of the dark surface of the altar, still tethered by the chain around her neck. After a moment's pause, energy seemed to crackle up from inside the obsidian. It reminded her of electricity trying to find the ground, except it reached for the dragon-shaped pendant instead. Arcs of energy shot off from the wings of the key. It created something that resembled a crackling ball of energy, and inside that energy an image appeared. Anwen leaned forward to get a better look, her elbows now resting on the glass-like surface. For the briefest of moments, she felt as though she was underwater. Her ring flashed like a beacon as she seemed to tip into the sphere of energy, as one would slip into a pool. Immediately, Anwen knew she'd traveled a great distance in the blink of an eye. Her feet skimmed across the surface of grass and other vegetation indigenous to a plain, and up ahead stood 3 megaliths of stone, almost as if someone had pushed them up through the earth. The middle stone stood taller than the others, like a finger pointing to the heavens.
Across the plains you must venture, if your heart be true. Find the next turning in the middle. The beacons wait for you.
Then, almost as if in reverse, she felt herself being pulled out of the energy like she'd been yanked out of water. She gasped, her voice breaking the silence of the temple. Her entire body felt soaked to the bone. And when she looked down at her clothes, she realized they were just as wet as they felt. A rumbling noise seemed to fill the air and the ground quaked under her. She quickly got to her feet and looked around for the source. It took her a moment to realize the entire building was shaking. Without another thought, Anwen's feet carried her quickly out of the sanctuary as the stones underfoot began to dance. It made walking difficult. Somehow she made it out without being thrown to the ground. Once there, she found the courtyard experiencing the same kind of seizure. Hurry, hurry. The stones from the pathway seemed to call out to her. Hurry, hurry. Anwen rushed to obey, all but leaping across the shifting flagstones. She almost twisted an ankle as one stone tipped underneath her, but she managed to stay upright. She leapt for the security of the path as the ground underneath disappeared, not even bothering to wonder if the rest would follow. She raced back the way she'd come. The plants and cobwebs she'd anticipated in the tunnel the first time were more than present this time around. She had to fight her way through them. With one last burst of energy, she cleared the shadowy path. She landed with a bit of a skid back in the courtyard where Tyler and Walter were just turning around to look at her.
I have the next clue.
Anwen gasped as her breath tried to catch up with her. Her entire body ached as if she'd run a marathon and was far from ready for it. That and her shins stung from hitting into the sharp stone of the main clearing, and her arms stung from the thorns and vines. Tyler moved to her side, helping her back to her feet.
How?
He asked, his eyes filled with confusion. He scanned the area before turning back towards her. How could she have found the clue in only a matter of seconds? And why was she soaking wet? But Anwen shook her head.
Long story. I think we should get going before the rest of this place decides to go.
She glanced towards the opening she'd come through only moments before. It had filled in with choked stones and other debris, looking as if it had always been that way, with vines covering the hole. Walter glanced at the dragon, not sure what was going on. Whatever it was, it had something to do with the supernatural. That or Anwen had finally lost it. He wasn't sure he wanted to find out which.
Maybe she's right.
He reasoned. His skin prickled a bit in an uncomfortable manner.
Come on. Let's head out, and we can figure things out from there.
Can you walk?
Tyler asked Anwen, noting the bruises on her knees. Blood trickled from a cut she'd received from one of the rocks, but she nodded.
I'm fine. We need to get away from the trees and find a place where I can look at the map.
The two men nodded to each other. Questions could wait for later. Until then, it would be wise to figure out what was going on. And the fastest way to do that was to follow Anwen's advice. They turned to lead her back out towards the camp they'd left earlier that morning. Courtney felt Callum's presence before she actually saw him. He was either getting rusty in his old age, or he wasn't being as careful as usual. That or she was getting better at sensing him. Whatever the case might be, she felt glad he hadn't been able to sneak up on her.
Has the council decided?
She asked, not bothering to turn away from watching her fellow mages spar. Several hours had passed since her impromptu visit to the council chambers. She hadn't yet heard word one way or another, but instead of being impatient, she felt a sense that everything would work out, regardless of what anyone thought. Whatever decision they made, she would have to live with it. There was no reason to go against it. She knew Kern would be fair either way. The Dragon Lord cleared his throat, though it sounded more like the rumbling of boulders.
They have,
Callum said, hinting to their answer with his tone. He wasn't happy with the outcome, that much was certain.
You will be granted your request,
He continued.
Kern will put it to the others to see who is most suited to pair with your associates.
Courtney couldn't help but turn and look up at his tone. She could see by his behavior alone that this admission had cost him. His tale seemed less pert than usual. His entire countenance seemed somehow chastened as well. She averted her eyes, not wishing to add to his discomfort.
Thank you.
She managed.
Please let me know when that's been decided.
Callum gave her a quick nod, realizing she wasn't going to gloat or do anything childish. He raised one brow at her, wondering for the first time what was going through her mind. Since he'd partnered with her as a mentor, he felt tempted to continue the motion. As such, he should volunteer to train for battle with her. Yet another part of him still couldn't bring himself to do so. Without so much as another word, he turned and left the area. The blonde mage couldn't help but watch him leave. What must it have cost him to come and tell her this decision? She still had no idea why he disliked mortals so much. Perhaps something tragic had happened. She doubted it had anything to do with romance, and now was not the time to ask. The other mages had stopped practicing to watch the exchange between Courtney and the Dragon Lord. Seeing their distraction, Courtney sighed.
You won't get any better if you stop and stare at the slightest interruption.
Courtney admonished. She moved back down to the practice field, hoping they'd do the same.
A wise woman I once knew told me that the battle will not wait for you. You either meet it head-on with all you've got, or not at all. Anything in between will only get you killed. Now try again.